On Christmas of 2002, the police were called to the Wolaver family house for a welfare check. What they discovered there would haunt an entire town. This is the Christmas night murders. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also hating Christmas. I'm the Grinch. No, I don't actually hate the holiday. That was a joke. But today, we're going over the Christmas night murders of the Wolaver family that occurred in 2002. You're going to learn about a very sick individual and his revenge. For our story, we're heading to Middletown, Pennsylvania. The first time we've been to PA. The city has a population of about 10,000 people, and it's Dauphin County's oldest community. Founded in 1775 by a man named George Fisher, it's located on the east shore of the Susquehanna River. It was used as a supply depot for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. It's considered to be a borough, which is pretty much just a town, but usually smaller than a city. Most things to do would be on the outskirts of Middletown, but there's a few things to do here. You could visit the Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad and enjoy a pumpkin train ride. Or you could go to Elks Theater and see a movie. To me, it sounds like a normal town, but something that happened here 20 years ago on this exact same date would haunt the town forever. Ernest Ray Wholaver Jr. was born on April 23rd of 1960. Pretty much nothing is known about his early childhood, besides that he has a brother named Scott. He comes into the picture a little bit later. Ernest went to Central Cambria High School and graduated in the class of 1978. Within the next 2 years, he would get a job at the Cambria County Trucking Company and meet a woman named Jean Ann Bittman. Jean was born on December 8th of 1959 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, to Joseph and Mary Ann Bittman. She was employed at the Harrisburg Hospital, Pinnacle Health Systems. The couple would get married and go on to have 2 girls. The first being Victoria, or Vicky, and she was born on December 27th of 1981. While in school, she played field hockey and was considered to be a shining light, a person that every time you saw, she had a smile on her face. She worked at Salvatore's and Kids' Quarters in Middletown and was a very beloved teacher. She was in a relationship with a guy named Frank Ramos, and together they had a baby girl named Madison. They broke up, and Victoria ended up getting engaged to a guy named Jeff Martin. The second daughter that was born to the Wolavers was Elizabeth, or Izzy, and she was born on May 13th of 1987. She was a 10th grader at Middletown Area High School and was a very well-spirited girl. But both Vicky and Izzy were keeping secrets about their father, which I wouldn't go as far as to call him that. More like an excuse. Both of the daughters were frightened of Ernest, in fact, and the reason being was that he was abusing them in every way you can imagine. In June of 2002, the girls came together with their mother and talked about things, and then they went to the police. It was found that Ernest had started Victoria when she was about 6 years old, and Elizabeth when she was in the 5th grade. Reading about the things that he did to them is absolutely sickening, so I won't go into full detail. Victoria said that Ernest promised not to do anything to Elizabeth as long as Victoria kept it a secret. One day though, she had this really sick, strong feeling and asked Elizabeth if she had experienced a similar thing with their father. Elizabeth told Victoria that she did and that she was afraid of him. Victoria then had a conversation with one of her aunts where she said, "It's happening to Izzy. It's happening to Izzy. He promised it wouldn't happen to Izzy. It's Dad doing it to us." Elizabeth said that he was mean. He was really short-tempered and would always scream at them and hit them for things that they shouldn't be punished for. She said she was scared to tell anybody about this because he told her that it would ruin his marriage and that if she ever told anyone, he'd kill her. One time, Ernest actually held an unloaded gun up to Elizabeth's head as a joke. Yeah, definitely some kind of joke. But she ended up testifying in court that Ernest was bigger than her, and she wasn't that big, and she was afraid of him hurting her. So Victoria, Elizabeth, and their mother Jean sought a protection front order to protect Elizabeth. The girls were very nervous about this being made public, and the secret was finally being disclosed. They were worried because this put them at risk. Ernest had already made threats, and it was only time before he acted on them. Jean Wolaver was in shock from the allegations that her husband was harming their daughters. She was very exhausted, very upset, and had no idea what to do. She ended up separating from Ernest, and he was then arrested. This same month, or July of 2002, he ended up posting a $100,000 bail and moved back in with his parents and younger brother, Scott. They lived in Cambria, which was about 3 hours away from Middletown. He wasn't allowed near any of the girls or Jean and wasn't allowed to possess a firearm. His trial was set to begin on January 3rd of 2003. On December 24th of 2002, Joe and Mary Bittman were waiting on their daughter Jean to arrive with their granddaughters Victoria and Elizabeth and their great-granddaughter Madison. It was a Christmas Eve tradition for the girls to go to their grandparents' house. They would spend the night so that way they could all be together during Christmas Day and open presents. Mary became concerned when they were all late for dinner. It was about a 2.5-hour drive from Middletown to Jonestown, and it was December and snowing this day. She assumed that they had potentially hit traffic. So Mary made many calls to Jean, and they all went to either the voicemail or the answering machine, and none of the calls were returned. She then decided it was time to call the police because things just didn't seem right. Mary first asked if there had been any accidents on the highway, but there wasn't. She then asked if they could go do a welfare check at the Wolaver family's house. The dispatcher, however, didn't really care or seem worried in the slightest bit. They told Mary to call back the next day if Jean and the girls still hadn't shown up or she received no calls from them. The dispatcher had said because the weather was bad to just give it some time. Mary, however, knew that something wasn't right. By the next morning, the girls still hadn't arrived, and so she made another phone call to the police. She asked them once again to go do a welfare check, and this time they did. Sergeant Robert Givler was given the task, and so he went over to the Wolavers' home a little bit after 7 a.m. When he first got there, nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary. He knocked on the front door, tried to ring the bell, but he got no answer. The blinds were drawn in the house, and so this made it difficult for him to look through the windows. He ended up making his way around to the back of the house, and things started to appear off. The glass windows to the garage door were broken in, and the door wasn't locked. Sergeant Givler opened the door, and he saw Jean's car. He then tried knocking on the door from the garage to the house, and he still got no answer. After he tried to open the door and found out that it was unlocked. He walked inside and started to call out to anyone that was potentially in the house, but got no answer. A few steps in, and he immediately knew that everything was completely wrong. In the kitchen laid the body of 43-year-old Jean Wolaver. Sergeant Givler went to check her pulse, and she was cold to the touch. The police assumed that she was making her morning coffee around 4 a.m. when someone snuck up behind her and shot her, causing her to drop the coffee filter that she was holding. Sergeant Givler then called for backup so they could figure out what happened. He specifically called for the homicide unit and the crime scene investigation unit. When backup arrived, Givler and the rest of the officers cleared the first floor. But that's when they heard a noise arise, a very distinctive cry. It was coming from upstairs, and so armed, they walked up the staircase. Laying outside of a bedroom, police find another body. However, something else was off. The body was identified as Victoria, the eldest daughter. She was shot once in the top of the head, but she also had her daughter, Madison, with her. Madison was alive, crying and screaming, but she was unharmed. She was severely dehydrated, hungry, and also in need of a diaper change. The police believed that Victoria had curled over Madison in an attempt to try and protect her, and it worked. Victoria had been running to Elizabeth's room when this happened, as she was found outside of her room. Elizabeth was also deceased, and she was found lying on the bed. She was also shot one time in the head, but she had burns on her hands as well, indicating that she may have grabbed the gun when it was fired. All three of the women were shot with a .22 caliber pistol, but there were no weapons found at the crime scene. While investigating further, officers found that the phone lines were cut outside of the house, indicating that even if the women had wanted to call for help, they couldn't. The police started looking into people closest to them and immediately found out what happened with Ernest. They had him come in to talk to them about the murders. He told them that he heard about what happened from a family member, but didn't know who could have killed them. When the police asked him where he was, he had an alibi. He said that him and his brother Scott were out in the woods hunting deer and coyotes from about 2 a.m. to 9 a.m. Scott was brought in and ended up confirming this. So the police started to look into some other possible suspects. One of them was named Frank Ramos, the father of Madison. Victoria and Frank, or Frankie, had a bad relationship. They had lived together for one point for a pretty long time. The police had went to their place on numerous occasions because of them constantly fighting. Frankie thought that Madison wasn't his and only accepted it when Victoria took a paternity test. The police ruled him out, however, because he had a solid alibi, which placed him in Reading, PA, which was about an hour and a half away. They then looked into a guy named Turner Higgins, who was a previous on and off boyfriend of Victoria. He was a locksmith, and also the guy that changed the locks for Jean when Ernest moved out. But he was cleared by his alibi. The police then executed search warrants for Ernest's parents' house and also his car. In the car, they found a notebook that Scott was writing on. He wrote, "We were out spotting deer and coyotes." It's almost like he was writing it down, trying to consciously remember, as if that's not what they were doing. Well, that's because that's not what they were doing. The investigators brought both Ernest and Scott back in for questioning. Ernest refused to speak and asked for an attorney. Scott, on the other hand, he was a nervous wreck. At first, he stuck by his same story, which he originally told, which was that him and Ernest were out in the woods from 2 a.m. to 9 a.m. The police then showed him crime scene photos of his sister-in-law and nieces. Scott gave in and told the police everything he knew. This is what really happened on Christmas Eve of 2002 at the Wolaver's residence. On December 23rd, Ernest and Scott were out drinking near their parents' home in Cambria. At about 1 a.m., Ernest said to Scott that he wants to go to Middletown to get his dog from his ex-wife. Scott knew that he wasn't allowed to be anywhere near Middletown because of his bail conditions, but he drove him anyway. They took turns driving, and at one point they stopped so Ernest could change into some dark clothing. Nearly 3 hours later, they arrived in town. Ernest told Scott to park down the block and remain in the car. He then grabbed some items from the back seat and took off towards the house wearing a ski mask and gloves. When he arrived to the home, he went to the telephone lines located outside and cut them. After, he broke a window to the garage door and let himself in, and then one by one took the lives of his family. This took a total of about 5 to 10 minutes, and Ernest ran back to the car and appeared to be in an agitated state. He said, "Drive, drive, drive," and he was shaking and nervous, and also said, "You wouldn't believe what I saw." On the way back to Cambria County, the brothers stopped multiple times so Ernest could change his clothes and then get rid of the murder weapons. A shotgun and a pistol, a .22 caliber to be exact. Like I said, Scott snitched and told the police everything, and he then took them to where Ernest had gotten out of the car at. The state police cadets searched every inch of the area and were this close to calling off the search. But that's when one of the officers looked down and in between some rocks saw something that was orange in color. It was the rusted barrel of a pistol. They ran the serial number and found out that the gun belonged to Ernest Wholaver's uncle, or his mother's brother. The police did ballistic testing, and it showed that this was the murder weapon. In January of 2003, Ernest was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, and the state sought the death penalty. Scott was charged as an accomplice and held without bail. But in a plea deal, he agreed to plead guilty to 3 counts of third-degree murder and was given a 12 to 25-year sentence before he became eligible for parole. While Ernest was in jail and awaiting trial, he attempted to hire a hitman through another inmate. Ernest had the idea of having Frankie Ramos killed to make it look like he did it himself. Frankie, once again, was the father of Madison, or Victoria's child, or Ernest's granddaughter. Frankie's note that he would leave behind would say that he was the actual killer. The other inmate went to the prison guards about this, and they ended up setting up Ernest. A DEA agent from West Virginia posed as a hitman, and the authorities recorded them discussing the killing using a code word tank, which stood for Ramos. This was just another charge that was added onto the list of pending charges for Ernest. During the trial, Scott testified that when Ernest moved back home, he said that he would shoot Jean. The theory was that the women were all killed to silence them and prevent the girls from their testimonies. Ernest Wholaver Jr. was eventually convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder, killing prosecution witnesses, conspiracy, reckless endangerment of Madison, burglary, and criminal solicitation. He was acquitted of the charges and sentenced to 3 death sentences, and as of right now, he's still on death row. On January 10th of 2014, the Pennsylvania Superior Court ruled that the charges against Ernest would stay on his criminal record. Although the jury acquitted him, they only did so because he murdered the witnesses that were going to testify against him. The Superior Court noted that the charges were inextricably tied to the murders, and that Ernest is not entitled to the relief that would expunge his record. Ernest is never getting out of jail, and one day, justice will prevail. Him and his brother Scott are both awful excuses for humans, and terrible people to say the least. It's incredibly sad to know what Jean, Victoria, and Elizabeth endured that tragic Christmas Eve. A time that you're supposed to spend with family and loved ones and just enjoy life. They were fighting for theirs, and Victoria fought all the way to the end to protect Madison, which is brave to say the least. She also tried to protect her younger sister Elizabeth, and when she found out that Elizabeth was having the same thing happen, she knew what she had to do. What the girls did was absolutely the right thing. It's just awful knowing that they let that monster out of jail, especially considering that the girls were afraid of him and what he would do. I really hope that they're all resting peacefully, and on today, the 20th anniversary of their death, I hope that Victoria's daughter Madison has found some closure. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please subscribe and hit the like button because that's all we do. I also have a second account with my brother named Horrifying, where we tell stories about everything paranormal. This includes true crime, mysteries, and things that are just downright spooky. I'd greatly appreciate if you subscribe to that too. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.